Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
This is Breakthrough News, and you're watching the Freedom Side.
Did you just see
Rania?
me go dark, Eugene? Okay,
No,
so basically,
I heard a
my
very loud
electricity.
sound. I thought it was an emergency alert.
It was the light. It was the generator and like all the lights turning back on. So like at the top of the hour, the state electricity went out and then the generator came on. So like as soon as we went live, I went like it literally went pitch black in this room,
Okay,
and then
well,
everything came back on like just in time. So hello,
Hello, I'm just glad
what a
there's
great
not a
way to
lost
start
child.
the show. With the electricity coming back on.
Yes. Well, that's Rania Khalek talking to you there, my intrepid co-host. I'm Eugene per year. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
Great to be back alongside you, Eugene. I feel very thankful that there's lights.
As do I. It's good for our show, for sure. And we've got a great show for you here today, as we always do. We'll be talking West Africa, Texas border, possible deeper regional war in the Middle East, the 40th anniversary of the landless workers movement in Brazil, the massive protests happening amongst farmers in France, very interesting story, and the Italy-Africa summit, and maybe even a little bit more than that. So we are around the world and back again. So plenty for you here, as always. And you are watching here on YouTube, so it would be a great time to remind you that our great show here is just the tip of the iceberg of the fantastic content that we put out on a regular basis, including Rania's show, Dispatches with Rania Khalek. So you wouldn't want to miss any of that. So make sure you hit the subscription button. It says subscribe, and then go ahead and hit the bell, which is so that you will be alerted to the things that you have subscribed to. So that way you will be able to follow Breakthrough News without breaking a sweat. Make it very easy for you to watch and hopefully share our content. Rania, anything else you would like our viewers to know?
I mean, so much. Where do I start, Eugene? I know. I'll start with the fact that if you want to support Breakthrough News, you can become a member. Did you know that, Eugene? You can become a member of Breakthrough News.
I did.
At patreon.com/breakthrough news. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, become a member, and you can access exclusive content in addition to some very cool merch, including that very cool, there it is. Like this is, I'm showing you the back of it. Eugene's showing you the front of it, or whichever side you think is the back or the front. Very cool Breakthrough News mug, along with other cool items as well. So I highly encourage you to become a member. You can also become someone who contributes to independent media during a time when we need it more than ever. Also, if you want to do a one-time donation, you can do it in the live chat, or you can go to breakthroughnews.org and make a one-time donation there. And I do encourage everybody who's watching to please, in addition to making sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News across all platforms, including here on YouTube, as well as Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, at BT Newsroom. Make sure if you are watching this stream to please hit that like button. Smash that like button.
Smash
Still waiting for
that
Matt to
like
make
button.
Smash that like button. Yes. Oh my God, I'm so happy right now. You have no idea. Eugene looks so unhappy. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. Well, I think you should listen to. I'm just going to be happy for the both of us. I think I have enough to go around for the both of us here. Make sure you smash that like button, please. It helps boost us in the algorithm. I am over the moon right now. I know Eugene is not.
Well, here's a fact, since patreon.com/breakthrough news is still on the page. You know, we're almost amazingly at 600,000 YouTube subscribers. So salute to all of our subscribers. But if all 600,000 or soon to be 600,000 Rania gave us $5 a month, that would be like $30-some million a year. So you can see that a relatively small sacrifice on your part as a viewer can make a huge difference in what we're able to do. So we really appreciate everyone making whatever sacrifice you can of whatever amount. But just know that even what may seem like a small amount of money, $5 a month or something like that, actually can have a huge impact. So anything anyone can do, we really, really appreciate any support you can get. And to all of our patrons and other donors who are out there already watching this, thank you so much for everything that you already do. But if you're not there, patreon.com/breakthrough news. And yeah, make sure you like the stream, the thumbs up button, as we move forward here in the show. But we want to start here today with a story that has become one of the biggest stories around the world, certainly one of the biggest, touches on one of the biggest issues in the U.S. election. That's immigration, what's happening at the Texas border currently. And we are very, very honored for this conversation to be joined once again by Todd Miller, who's an author and journalist specializing in border issues. Todd, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene. It's great to be with you again.
Well, great to have you here. And I guess my first question is, there's a lot of very potent headlines about what's happening in Texas. People saying there's another civil war coming. Nikki Haley saying today Texas can secede if they want to. So passions are obviously high, but maybe just give us a sense, what are the actual sort of legal issues at the border that have brought Texas state officials and the federal government into at least some state of conflict, it seems?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to this story, and unfortunately it's getting churned through the kind of partisan media machine, right? But what's happening is that the Texas state government, through what is called Operation Lone Star, which is a $4.5 billion operation that Texas started in 2021. That operation is what happened was that it involves Texas police, state police, and National Guard, and they took over this small park in Eagle Pass, Texas, and they took it over because they claimed that the U.S. Border Patrol was cutting the concertina wire and that razor wire, and they wanted to stop that. And so there's been a standoff ever since, that's been getting played up quite a bit in the media. I want to, that's what's going on. My interpretation of this is that we're seeing what I would characterize as border theater. Border theater, is it any coincidence that this is happening during an election year? I don't think so. Is it any coincidence that this is happening under the regime of Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, who's been all about securing the border and who is a big Donald Trump supporter? No, I don't think it is. Is it any coincidence this is happening while the kind of messaging from the right wing in the United States is that the border, we have open borders, quote unquote open borders? No. And so I think what we're seeing here, and why I call it theater, because what is being created is this kind of instead of what is really going on in the border, which we can definitely talk about, we're getting this kind of partisan clash. Or we have a governor who's trying to promote a message saying that there's an open border and we need to do something more about it. That's making a stand at the small park in Eagle Pass and against the federal government. And then we have the federal government who's in charge. The legal issue is that the federal government is in charge of border enforcement. And so this taking over of this small park is a big challenge to that, maybe even an embarrassment to the federal government. So then we get this clash and the conflict. But one thing I wanted to say is that if you look at Operation Lone Star, again, it's been going on for two years now, across the state of Texas. This has not happened up to this point. I regularly see Operation Lone Star in action with my own eyes in El Paso. And what you see is the state operation, the National Guard, the police, working alongside and collaborating with the U.S. Border Patrol. And on top of that, the U.S. Border Patrol has collaborated or is collaborating with police departments, including state police departments, all across the U.S. Mexico border, in Arizona, New Mexico, and California as well. And that's been part of their enforcement fabric now for decades. And on top of that, the Border Patrol regularly works with National Guard. So we have what appears to be a conflict in one place, where in other places, these forces are working in collaboration with each other. And so how this has been spun in the media has been quite alarming. Like I read from a more liberal point of view yesterday that they were calling, that this might be the quote unquote end of America. And I'm like, what? I mean, well, maybe that's a good idea, right? It seems like everything just has reached a new level of hyperbole. And this hyperbole is just is really setting the stage, I think, of what we're going to see a lot of this year with the elections coming. A lot of this sort of thing, the sort of bravado of state governments, especially with Republican governors, versus the federal apparatus, which is also a very punitive, enforcement oriented, even brutalizing to migrants apparatus, as if they're in conflict with each other, when in reality they've worked hand in hand over decades now.
So I think it's important. Like, everything you're saying is obviously very important. And a lot of it is being framed in the context of like, oh, this harkens to some sort of civil war type situation. Because you've like the state, opposed to the federal government. But there's also this sort of like other narrative in the backdrop, which is Republicans versus Democrats in the upcoming election and what this means for Trump versus Biden. And obviously Trump, plays on the anti-immigrant sentiment. There, of course, I would imagine is some kind of concern that the far right, especially the organized, violent, armed far right, gets very excited whenever anything anti-immigrant happens, especially on a national scale. So I guess I'm curious how you see this playing out politically. But first, I have to just note that we need to clarify here on Breakthrough News that there is no relation, I hope, between Todd Miller and Matt Miller. That's all I want to say. Matt Miller, the spokesperson who gets on in front of the podium every day in front of reporters and embarrasses himself and then goes viral for defending genocide. I just want to throw that out there. I'm assuming there's no relationship between the two of you. No. That's my dad joke for the day, Eugene. Eugene was waiting for my dad joke. But no, I'm sorry. Not to make too much of the dark humor in these horrible, horrible times. But no, to go back to what I was saying, Todd, I'm curious if you can speak a bit about the political implications in terms of the upcoming election. Because I think there's something that ends up happening with this narrative. And that is the idea that Democrats and Republicans are somehow like on different sides of this issue. And of course, there are some differences. At the end of the day, this is happening under Biden. Nothing has changed under Biden. So I guess, can you address that?
Yeah, and that's a super good question, because this is kind of what this is why I would say border theater, because it creates this notion that these two sides are on opposite ends and the Democrats are all about quote unquote open borders and the Republicans are about secure borders. And that's not what the reality is at all, right? So like coming into this election year, if you go to 2023, and the Biden administration had the largest border and immigration enforcement budget ever, $29.8 billion if you take customs and border protection, immigration and customs enforcement. And that translates into the wall, maintenance of 700 miles of walls and barriers, the maintenance of and new hiring of nearly 21,000 U.S. Border Patrol agents, an air and marine unit coming out of Customs and Border Protection, basically a domestic Air Force and Navy, right? So the idea that there's open borders or the Biden administration isn't continuing the kind of border enforcement and the ramp up of it over the years, like $29.8 billion, I assume once it's all said and done, that'll be similar in 2024 as far as budgets are concerned. That's higher than when Trump ended, right? Trump ended his in 2020 with a, what was it, like $25 billion budget annual. I'm talking annual budgets here. And so Biden's not only has been continuing many of the policies under Trump, but has been piling on the budget to make it the fortification even more. And with the extra stress on technology and extra stress on this kind of surveillance apparatus, the sophisticated cameras, the robotic dogs, right? They're UGVs, they call them, or the unmanned ground vehicles, the sort of robotization. I always say that word, and I don't even know if that's a word, but it's kind of it's like turning, the kind of digitization of the border. And this is all happening under Biden. And I suspect, given the dynamics and given the strong criticism that comes from the right and coming out of what's going on in Texas right now, what has happened historically with Democrats, especially in election year, is instead of going towards a less sort of enforcement oriented policy or strategy, they double down on it. The iron fist comes down even more. And that's, as we sit here in January, I suspect we're going to see these displays by the Biden administration over until November, showing that they are going to be strong on the border. And there's every indication, like these border bills that are floating around right now, there's every indication that this is going to happen.
One of the things that I'm curious, hoping you could speak to, Todd, as well, is it almost feels like there's like a logical fallacy behind this as well. Like the whole concept is if we just have more, quote unquote security at the border, that people will stop coming. I don't want to editorialize too much. I just wonder how you respond to that, because that seems to underpin sort of both sides of the argument here.
Yeah, it's false. I mean, if you just look at the first real border operations of the modern era, I would call it modern era, but you're talking the 1990s. But I call it the modern era because there's a deterrent strategy, which still exists today. And those deterrent strategy was basically enforcing the cities so people couldn't cross, so they'd have to cross through like the deserts of the Southwest, which are impassable or really difficult to cross. And the idea with that deterrence, the word would get around that it's dangerous. People are going to die. If you go back to the Border Patrol memorandum in 1994, they say mortal danger, right? People are going to die. That would stop people from coming. At the same time, 1994 NAFTA, of course, is implemented. Boom, huge displacement issues going on in Mexico, especially with small farmers and lots of people going north. I mean, it didn't. Like this, I use that example because that is the prime example, I think, to building up, like during those years in the 90s, the border enforcement budget tripled. It made it so much more difficult to cross, but then more people came than ever before. So historically, the deterrence strategy probably does have an effect. I'm sure people hear the dangers and have to think twice or three times or four times. But the kind of why people are coming, the root causes, like what are the, like, why was NAFTA a reason? Why is like giving corporate power the open border to go and do anything they want anywhere in Mexico, right? Whether that's like mining entire communities or whatever, right? And why, like, how can we not make that correlation and look at some other policies that really go into lots of different issues? I mean, when we could, in order to do that, we have to have a much longer conversation. We have to unpack like economic situations all throughout, not only Mexico, all throughout Latin America. We have to look at U.S. history politically in all these places. If we want to talk about the violence in Central America, then we have to unpack that. A lot of times the word violence is thrown out there, but not unpacked. So we just have to think, that's just the natural way of things in whatever country we're talking about. No, it's not. It's there. Those things happen because of lots of root historic reasons. And for me, I think for like the idea of securing the border is ridiculous to stop people from coming if you're not considering like these bigger, deeper historic issues or the real life and death issues that people have to make them think, we're going to try this to help our situation out.
Mm-hmm. Well, Todd, thankfully we have authors and journalists like yourself who writing quite a bit on border issues. So I hope everyone has the opportunity to check out all of your work. Where can they find you if they are more interested?
Go to the borderchronicle.com. I along with another journalist, Melissa Dobosque, we publish every Tuesday and Thursday. And on that website, if you're interested in books, our books, we both have books. It's on. You can find them there, and you can see updates and all these different stories. This Texas story, we're going to be following that among 100,000 other things, in this next year.
Right on. Well, Todd Miller, as always, thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much, Eugene and Rania. Bye.
Rania?
Well, I'm glad to have Todd to put that in perspective because, I mean, whenever the issue of the border immigration makes it into the mainstream, it's usually, obviously it's captured the national attention, but it's usually politicized in this way that doesn't give any context to exactly what he was talking about. Like, why are people coming here? How is it that both parties are pretty much like bipartisan on this issue, just with some slight rhetorical differences here and there? So yeah, appreciate Todd.
No, definitely appreciate him. And I hope people check out his work, his book for sure, which goes back to some of that stuff he was mentioning there at the end towards the 90s. It feels like we kind of swung back around to then, actually, where you had the Republicans and the Democrats under Clinton, now Biden, who was, also for the strict measures then, swinging back around. But it's amazing how bipartisan these really... I mean, they're brutal, but it's also worth noting they're ineffectual. It's kind of like the death penalty, I mean, it's sort of wrong on its face, but then when you actually dig into it, and you find that it has no deterrent effect and it makes no difference in the states with the highest murder rate per 100,000 people all have the death penalty, and you start to think, well, wait a second, not only is it bad, but it doesn't work. These border policies, same thing. I mean, they're in and of themselves inhumane, but they're actually not working. So that in and of itself, I think, is an important piece. But nonetheless, check it out. And
Definitely.
also, it's a little bit older, but you did do a long episode of Dispatches with Todd that I think gets into some of that history that I think is still very, very relevant.
Absolutely. I encourage
Yep.
people to go check that out.
I hope they do too. Dispatches with Rania Kalik. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a patron. You'll be able to see the excellent second part of all her dispatches, which is behind a paywall. But that's because it's for the specialist people. That being said, we want to turn our attention now to an issue that kind of flew under the radar, but is a pretty, or at least here in mainstream Western media, but a pretty major story. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, who have formed the Alliance of Sahel states. People may remember those are the three countries that had the popular military uprisings last year that established new governments. Those three countries have withdrawn from the regional bloc of West Africa, ECOWAS. So big story, big change in the politics of West Africa, and we are really excited to be joined here by Kwesi Pratt Jr., who's the General Secretary of the Socialist Movement of Ghana. Kwesi, thank you so much for being back with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you as always. And I guess my first question for you here is, why now? Why are these countries pulling out of ECOWAS at this time?
Well, I think it's just the recklessness of the leaders in West Africa, which is pushing these three countries.
Whoop, did we lose Kwesi?
Of French neo-colonialism.
Oh.
And they've done everything possible. Do we have some difficulties?
No, it looks like we did, but we got you now, so we're good to go. Maybe start from the top, though.
Okay. I'm saying that it is the recklessness of the leaders of West African countries which has pushed these three countries into the rebellion, and that these leaders of West African countries have been acting as support of French neo-colonialism. These three countries tried to break free of French imperialism. They wanted to take control of their own natural resources and to exploit these resources for the benefit of their people. They were also not happy with the establishment of French military bases all over West Africa. And West African leaders threatened to wage war on them, and they've imposed all manner of sanctions on them, making life quite unbearable for their people. And the option was open to them was to walk out of ECOWAS and try and establish what they call the Alliance of the Sahel, so that they can continue to pursue their objectives.
Actually, because this issue was really dominating international headlines for several months when there was like one coup after another, and then there was the kicking out of the French. And obviously, ECOWAS was used or weaponized, I should say, against Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to try to punish them or cajole them into, undoing those decisions. But I'm curious if you can update us. I think in the last few months, with the situation in Gaza has really overtaken international headlines. But obviously, this development has continued. Can you just fill our audience in on what has been taking place over the last couple months? Because last we saw, when this was getting international attention, the French were being kicked out. And I think, like I said, international headlines have been dominated by Gaza and the broader tensions in the Middle East. So what has happened since?
Well, a number of significant things have happened, and one of them is just that these three countries have formed a defense alliance, and they've made it quite clear that an attack on one will be considered as an attack on all. The other most significant thing that has happened is that ECOWAS has expressed a willingness to negotiate, but negotiate for the restoration of so-called multi-party democratic order, which is just a charade, And then, of course, in all the three countries, there have been movements, towards improving the economic well-being of their people. When the crisis started, Niger was one of the poorest countries in the world, if not the poorest country in the world. Within the last couple of months, Niger has become the fastest growing economy in the world. And one would have thought that these bankrupt West African leaders would be going to these coup leaders to find out what they're doing right and to learn from them, rather than threaten them with coup d'etats and with confrontation and blockades and so on. So pretty much that is what has been happening.
I wonder what is the sort of future now for ECOWAS as a bloc? I mean, obviously there are other, a number of other members, but to have lost, so many countries, sort of key countries. I mean, Mali especially is such a historic role, in African independence movements, the establishment, all three of them actually, of ECOWAS. I mean, are there broader repercussions, do you think, for the bloc here? Or will it become maybe kind of a bloc politics where there's more of a left wing and a right wing in West Africa emerging in terms of alliances?
Well, I think that in West Africa itself, many people see ECOWAS as an alliance of despotic leaders. Many people do not see ECOWAS as representing the interests of the people, the farmers, the workers, the youth, and so on. It's just an alliance of despots, and not many people will shake. And yet, what appears to be democratic governments in the region are worse than the coup regimes. Now, if you take a country like Ghana, the ruling party is appointing card-bearing members of the onto the Electoral Commission, which has responsible for supervising elections. I mean, what coup can be worse than that? If you take La Côte d'Ivoire, Alassane Ouattara actually changed the constitution, so that he can extend his mandate. What coup can be worse than that? There are many countries in West Africa where the ballot box is not respected at all by these leaders. And each time any of the leaders has infringed the constitution, has violated the constitution, has twisted arms, to gain power, all the others have lined up to go and congratulate him. These are not leaders who can be talking to us about democracy, the ethos of democracy, and so on. You understand? These are hypocrites. These are people who are not pursuing the interests of West African people. These are people whose main agenda is to maintain the neo-colonial order. You understand? And I mean, they have no commitment to democratic practice in West Africa or anywhere else.
And kind of like moving or elaborating on that a bit on the other end of things, do you feel there is inspiration for other countries nearby after witnessing what took place in West Africa? I mean, I could imagine having an example of, movements from the ground up, pushing out the colonialists, and pushing and the sort of anti-imperialist rhetoric you're hearing about, protecting our sovereignty and our resources. The scary part for those in power, obviously, is that could spread. So do you see any evidence of that sentiment is inspiring others in other parts of the region, or perhaps is spreading? I mean, I know there's been protests in other nearby countries in over the last year, with similar thoughts. So yeah, is this something that you could see spreading across West Africa and even beyond?
Well, the fervor for change is very strong in West Africa, strong in West Africa. I mean, if you take a country like Senegal, Macky Sall, the leader, has virtually been repressing his people in order to keep his grip on power. There have been massive street protests. They've been confronted with tear gas, and pollution and so on. So there's a strong fervor for change in Senegal. Everywhere you turn in West Africa, there's a very, very strong fervor for change. And that is simply because the people are no longer able to bear exploitation and repression from their former colonial authorities. Now, listen, if you take all of French-speaking West Africa, all of them have to keep their foreign reserves in the Central Bank of France. Under these circumstances, they borrow their own money and pay interest on borrowing their own money. That's untenable. Completely untenable situation. You take Niger, just by changing the arrangement for the sale of gold and uranium, within a matter of 5 months, it has moved from the poorest country in the world to the fastest growing economy and so on. So many West Africans are frustrated, absolutely frustrated with the current arrangement. They're frustrated with the economic partnership agreement with the EU, which virtually makes them slaves. You understand? They need to build a new future. They need to start building a new future without Western military bases, which have failed to deal with the problems of insurgency in the sub-region. And you're talking about the problems of insurgency in the sub-region. If you take Nigeria, Nigeria has a total population of 330 million, virtually more than half the total population in West Africa. Nigeria suffers the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast. It has a secessionist rebellion in the east and a low-intensity civil war in the Niger Delta area. That's total confusion. That is chaos. Now, before the coup in Burkina Faso, more than 50% of the land area was controlled by these insurgents. The insurgents have waged war in Mali and Guinea. They've actually come down south and they've attacked the north of Benin and Ghana. And everybody knows that La Côte d'Ivoire is a sitting target. And any time from now, the insurgents could be attacking La Côte d'Ivoire. This is the region we are talking about. A region in extreme poverty, a region whose people do not have access to food and so on. That is the kind of situation we are talking about.
Kwesi, one thing I'm also very curious about is how you think this fits into sort of the shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world, because we've seen Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso engaging with many different countries from Russia to Iran to others. How are you seeing that sort of element of this playing out in terms of Africa's place here in a new multipolar world?
Well, I would put it in a slightly different way. And that is there's contestation for influence and power in West Africa. And it worries me. It worries me that everybody is coming to West Africa. Everybody's arming to the teeth in West Africa. You understand? When the explosion occurs, I don't know how things are going to look in West Africa. The United States, for example, has now completely abandoned I mean, the United States, in the midst of the de-recognition of the Niger government, actually sent an ambassador to Niger, which is a de facto recognition of the Niger government, in spite of all the statements that were being made by international organizations and so on. Only 2 weeks ago, the United States donated, a substantial amount of vehicles to the security forces in Burkina Faso. So there are indications that the United States really wants to put a foot in West Africa. Why? Is it because of some competition between the United States and France? Is that the case? Or is the United States stepping in to serve as the last bastion of Western imperialism in West Africa? We don't know. Now, last week there were reports that the Russians had sent in 100 soldiers, to protect the leader of the Burkina Patriotic Revolution. You understand? And there are all kinds of indications. You mentioned the interest of the Iranians and so on. I, as a West African, am worried by these developments. West Africa must be for the people of West Africa. Its destiny must be shaped by the people of West Africa. The people of West Africa ought to be able to decide what kind of government they want, what kind of institutions they want to build, and how to run their own affairs, So I am not particularly enthused about the divergent interests that are showing up in West Africa. It undermines the independence of the people of West Africa, their ability to take independent positions and so on.
Kwesi Pratt Jr., General Secretary of the Socialist Movement of Ghana, as always, thank you so much for joining us and helping us sort through it all.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you most for giving me the opportunity.
Anytime. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I really think that if you look all around the global south, there has been just in the last couple of years alone so much that's happened that has changed the world in the course of history, really. And I think the shifts in West Africa is a massive part of that. I mean, I think it's 2023, so, October 7th really kind of sort of was like an asteroid hitting in terms of how much it feels like it changed everything. But it really, so much has happened that it makes you forget that in 2023 alone, I mean, that was the biggest story for months and it didn't just go away. Things are still shifting. And I mean, Africa as a continent, you do this monthly seminar in Africa, which people should go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. And you can access Eugene's monthly seminar, which is super important because for the last few years, I mean, you've been on it really explaining all these different shifts across the continent in this region or that region. And it really is, I mean, I can't emphasize it enough. It's historic. The kinds of changes that we're seeing as we emerge into this sort of multipolar world. And as Africa really finds a way to come together in various areas of the continent to sort of push for, I don't know, their own interests. And I do encourage people to go watch our episode of Dispatches where you explain that well when it comes to the Horn of Africa. And I think it applies across the board.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I agree. And interesting, turbulent times, a lot of hope, a lot of scary things. But I guess that's just the nature of the world we live in. And moving on here to another place where there's, some certainty, some uncertainty, and that is West Asia, so-called Middle East, quote unquote, where it seems like there's at least a possibility of a deepening conflict, regional conflict. There's already a regional conflict, but one that could get worse and spiral to a greater degree. And we are very, very honored to be joined here once again by Brian Becker, who, among many other things, is the host of the Socialist program that airs here Wednesday evenings at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you really care about what's going on in Gaza, by the way, I really, really highly suggest you watch last night's episode with some important insight from those you will never hear from the mainstream media. But Brian, thanks so much for being back with us.
Great to be with you.
Well, I guess my first question here is maybe how are you reading the situation? I mean, obviously there is a lot of talk in the air that the United States or Israel or some combination of them may directly strike Iran. There could be a deepening conflict there, whatever the U.S. may or may not do in in Iraq. So, I mean, does it seem to you like we're sort of dominoes are falling, so to speak, to sort of another Middle Eastern morass, or is that perhaps maybe a little bit overdrawn?
Well, I think the the Biden administration is concerned about a regional war, concerned about a deepening and widening war. I think they're trying to prevent that from happening because the U.S. will lose the war, so will Israel. And there's a recognition that while Netanyahu may want to widen and prolong the war in Gaza into a regional conflict, because at least that way he can remain in office rather than remaining in jail, it's not really in the interest of the United States to have a larger war in the Middle East. Let's not forget that President Obama in 2011 said the U.S. must pivot to Asia. Why? Because the U.S. had been bogged down in losing wars in the Middle East, succeeding in killing a lot of people, but not winning the war. Meanwhile, China peacefully, accelerated its own development because the U.S. was bogged down somewhere else. So here we are, 13 years after President Obama's pivot to Asia, and the U.S. is bogged down again in a war in the Middle East. Netanyahu and Biden are tied at the hip. Both of you saw that the U.S. soldiers, 3 of them were killed by a drone strike in a military base in Jordan. I, for one, did not know that there was a military base in Jordan. I mean, there are U.S. military bases everywhere around the Middle East. But this is apparently the base where the U.S. has been conducting the Syria invasion, which has been going on for almost a decade now by the United States. U.S. troops are still illegally in Syria. So there's already a low-intensity regional war. Iran just announced that if the U.S. strikes Iran, which the Biden administration was suggesting it might, that Iran is completely ready to hit back. And just let's also remember, Rania mentioned with your last guest about how much has changed in the last year. Well, 4 years ago, General Soleimani, the Iranian military leader, was assassinated at Baghdad airport on orders of Donald Trump. And the Iranians struck back at U.S. military bases. More than 20 U.S. military bases were hit in Iraq. The Iranians said, we're having a measured response, but if you want to go for it, we're ready. And what did Trump do? What did the U.S. do? They did not retaliate a second time because they knew they would lose a regional war. So the U.S. is on the horns of a dilemma, completely with Israel in its catastrophic genocidal war against Gaza, completely with Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to prolong and widen the war. The U.S. can't escape that embrace because it did it itself. Biden did it himself. And yet a wider regional war will be a complete and utter disaster for U.S. imperialism. Again, a disaster for the people of the region, but I think a bigger failure for the United States should it, in fact, happen.
Brian, it is quite interesting. All this time, the U.S. it's had a contradictory mission. On the one hand, it's like, yes, Israel, go all the way, dismantle Hamas. We totally agree. We're, a little upset with maybe how far you've gone in doing it or how you've been a little embarrassing and bombing hospitals, but overall we'll defend it. The attitude is they have to take out Hamas in Gaza. However, at the same time, you have all of these groups that are part of the resistance axis repeatedly making it very clear, if you want this tit for tat between us and the U.S. and us and Israel, whether we're talking about Hezbollah, whether we're talking about Ansar Allah in Yemen, whether we're talking about the various Iraqi groups that are hitting U.S. bases, including the one that hit the base we had no idea existed in Jordan. They've all repeated the same things over and over again. If you want this to stop the genocide in Gaza. That is what will prevent this from escalating regionally. The U.S. has this ridiculous idea that there can continue to be a genocide in Gaza and they can just contain it there and somehow restrain it from, expanding across the rest of the region. But what I do think is interesting here with this contradiction is that the Biden administration has now leaked to the media today that they do plan to hit Iranian targets across Syria and Iraq for several days. But when they leak that ahead of time, to me, it suggests that they're trying to alert the Iranians to try to limit the casualties from their response, which is kind of something similar that they did with the Yemenis when they first bombed. I guess I'm just curious, like, how do you explain those contradictory ideas? On the one hand, you want Israel to dismantle Hamas. You keep giving Israel more time. You keep giving Israel all the weapons in the world because you need Israel to have some kind of victory. But on the other hand, it's completely catastrophic for a U.S. empire to have this expansion of the war across the Middle East, which is inevitable if this genocide in Gaza continues.
Yeah, no, those are really excellent points, Rania. And it's kind of the logic of empire is playing itself out here. And the logic of empire has inside of it a fundamental contradiction. The logic of empire is if the empire is hit, then they must carry out vengeance. They must show that they're the boss. They must show that they're not weak. They can't even accept neutrality. Neutrality is considered an act of conspiracy, in fact. So the logic of empire means that the empire must respond. So if U.S. soldiers are killed in killed in Jordan, then the U.S. must strike back. If the Houthis or the Yemeni people disrupt shipping to Israel, even if no one is killed, the U.S. considers it a blow against empire. If Hamas successfully bridges the wall on October 7th, it's considered an attack against the empire. Like the U.S. considers Israel to be an asset. It considers the shipping in the Red Sea to be its asset. It considers the military bases in the north of Jordan to be its asset. So whenever it is struck, the logic of empire requires vengeance, requires revenge, requires even disproportional response. And yet, to the extent that the empire does do these things, it sinks deeper and deeper into the quicksand of a war that it can't actually win. And why? Because the people of the Middle East, not the governments are mostly client states, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, largely client states. But the masses of people, hundreds of millions of Arab people or Iranian people or other peoples who inhabit the Middle East, have an anti-imperialist consciousness. And they're going to keep fighting. They're going to keep resisting. And the fact that the U.S. or Israel has military supremacy and can impose so many deaths on the other side, it doesn't change the consciousness of the people. In fact, it becomes a detonator, an accelerant for that consciousness to grow. So there's the contradiction. The empire must act the way empires do, and yet every act triggers more resistance, not from governments, but from people. So this is an epic battle between the people of the region who want to be free of colonialism, domination, Zionism, imperialism, racism, apartheid, and those who perpetuate it. So that's why, in a way, all of it, whether it's in Yemen with the so-called Houthis, or whether it's in Syria with the Syrian government, or the Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Islamic resistance in Iraq, these are different iterations, philosophical, ideological, or religious iterations of the same thing, which is the yearning of the people to be free people and to not live under the domination of empire. So this is the paradox, the horns of the dilemma that empire is on right now, and I don't think it can escape.
You know, I think this is a good question, and you know, maybe in some ways to many it feels obvious, but I think it deserves saying is why is this region of the world so important to them? Because I think many people would say, well, if China's the bigger issue, why don't they just leave anyway? Like, why do they need to stay there?
Yeah, and in fact, this policy actually doesn't make sense from the point of view of empire. I mean, Obama was trying to have this kind of geostrategic thinking about let's pivot away from endless conflict in the Middle East. That's when he started the Iran nuclear arms talks. He was trying to have some level of normalization with Iran. So there's a sort of intelligence, a geostrategic intelligence that tells U.S. policymakers, don't keep doing the same thing. Do something different, because in fact, this is a losing battle. But I think the real problem for them is the reflex of empire. The reflex of empire is if you are hit, if you are attacked, you must show that you will not be pushed around. You won't be a diminishing influence. You won't be a weakening empire. So the reflex is what keeps America doing things that are obviously stupid from the point of view of empire. Not only they're immoral, unethical, genocidal, etc., they're stupid, they're dumb, they don't make sense. They're a self-inflicted wound, but they can't do it because it's kind of like the mafia. If you defy the mafia in your neighborhood, and they don't come and shoot you, or they don't come and break your legs, then other people in the neighborhood think that they can defy the mafia. So it's the reflex of the empire, or the reflex of the 700-pound gorilla, those who exercise sort of unrestricted, undiluted power. Once they get challenged, once the bully is challenged and has a bloody nose, it's the end, basically. And so the Arab people, the people in the Middle East, generally speaking, are fighting back. Like, who would have thought on October 7th that the whole world would be changed as Rania has described the last 4 months? But it did change. And why did it change? It wasn't because Hamas was able to turn off the electricity in Israel, detonate neighborhoods, turn off the water, destroy whole areas. All of that has happened to the Palestinians in Gaza. All the people in Gaza did was they showed they were going to resist. And for 8 hours, they controlled, 8 hours, that's all it was. They controlled a part of historic Palestine across that border that was intentionally demolished in 1948 by Order Number 40 by the Israeli command. You can check the Israeli archives for that. For 8 hours, Palestinian people were in that neighborhood. And because of that, the empire says, no, we're going to go along with a genocidal campaign by a fascist government in Tel Aviv, because we preferred that over the idea that you can hit us and succeed. We must punish you, even if it means genocide and our association with genocide. We prefer that. This is the logic of empire, and why this empire will ultimately lose.
Yeah. I mean, it really is amazing how much has to, I feel like there's it's like before and after Christ, before and after October 7th. Like, that's kind of how the world feels right now. And so I'm curious to elaborate on the point you were making. Given everything you've said, I mean, I know what we can do here is speculate. We can't really predict anything, but we do have an emerging multipolar world, as we've talked about on this show many times. And I think you've always said, Brian, that polarity itself doesn't necessarily mean the world suddenly gets better, but it does give space to the global South that maybe it didn't have before in certain aspects. So I'm curious, how does post October 7th, when you have the entire order of the global North, the rules-based order, I mean, it's been completely, made into a mockery. Like, does it even exist anymore after this? Does international law exist after this? Does the U.S. even get to try to weaponize human rights like it did before? I'm not sure they can, after what the world has watched take place in Israel. So how can you put that, I guess, can you put that in the context of what it means in an emerging multipolar world to have a moment like this when the mask is completely off for the imperialist countries?
Well, I mean, if you think about it in a serious way, the multipolarity, which I think people are hoping will be a check on empire, a restraint on empire, that there will be other power centers. In some ways, that has not happened. What you see is that Russia and China have divergent interests with the United States, as does Iran, for instance. But they're not really a major factor right now. I mean, it's really the Yemenis and people in Lebanon whose acts of resistance are of some material aid to the people in Gaza. So you see Russia and China, they're saying words that are opposing the Israeli genocide, but they're not doing that much. They're actually worried about the war in the Middle East drawing them in which case it becomes a global conflict. Yes, they all said they gave a thumbs up to the South Africa genocide case at the ICJ. That was a sign of the multipolarity, that you had these two worlds, all of the global North, NATO powers saying no to South Africa, and all the countries of the global South saying yes to South Africa's case. But again, that's a legal matter. I think when I'm trying to summarize what's gone on since October 7th, I go back to this idea that it's the people themselves. It's the people of the region. It's the people of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and of course the Palestinian people first and foremost, who are really changing the equation. On October 6th, Israel was about to be embraced by the reactionary regimes of the Middle East and its rule. It's already completely oppressive rule is going to be sort of normalized. That's off the table right now. What put it off the table? It really wasn't other state actors. It wasn't Russia or China or Iran that interfered. It was the resistance of the Palestinian people themselves. And so that element of the historical process is the thing that I think should be emphasized at the moment, is the anti-colonial consciousness of the masses is in fact this other power. When we think of multipolarity, we think about the varying powers between the states. When I think about what's happened since October 7th, I see a global movement, grassroots movement of opposition, protest, dissent, resistance that has sprung up. In a way, it demonstrates in a nascent way the power of the people. It's kind of another power. It's not a state actor. It's not organized into one single group, but it is a power, and it is having an impact and has to be factored into the calculations of policymakers, even in some of the biggest, most powerful imperial countries.
Mm-hmm. Brian Becker, host of the Socialist program that airs right here on Breakthrough News, the video version at least, at 7 o'clock on Wednesdays. That's Eastern Time. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I always love Brian's perspective. I could listen to him talk about this stuff all day.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to have him back, but like I said, you can see him every Wednesday here, 7 p.m. But if you subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you get the alerts, you won't even have to go looking for it. Nonetheless, we are going to move the show forward here, turning our attention to Brazil, where Latin America's largest social movement, the landless workers movement of Brazil, is this year celebrating 40 years of existence. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Anna Cha, who is a member of the MST's National Coordination. Anna, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Eugene and Rania, for the invitation to be here and could talk a little bit about MST and Brazil.
Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us. And, I mentioned it at the outset, Latin America's largest social movement. But for those who maybe don't know, aren't as familiar with Brazil, what is the MST and what is it fighting for?
Okay, well, first, maybe it's important to say that Brazil, even nowadays, it's one of the countries with the highest land concentration. So around 1% of the big landowners own more than 50% of all lands in Brazil. So the land issue in Brazil since the invasion of the Portuguese, it's like one of the most structural issues of the Brazilian society, which until nowadays promotes highest inequality, misery, hunger, all social problems that we can see on the Brazilian society. And MST is a social movement that struggles for the democratization of the land, but also to build a political project of Brazil that ends with that inequality that I was talking, that ends with more than 33 million people in Brazil are still suffering nowadays. So MST, born 40 years ago, struggling against these large states of land, which were unproductive, but has made all our struggle to not just have access to land to the people who don't have land, but also to create a good life in the countryside of Brazil, and of course producing food, healthy food for all the society. So our struggle is not just for the landless people of Brazil, but we really believe that we have a lot to contribute to make Brazil a better country to all the Brazilians.
Rania, you're muted.
My apologies. I was turning the heater. I used to do this. Eugene knows. Anyways, I didn't want you guys to hear the beeping. But no, I really think it's incredible what your movement has been able to accomplish. And I'm just curious right now, what's at the sort of forefront, especially I mean, obviously Bolsonaro was in power. That was a huge threat to Brazil. Now you have Lula in charge. I guess, how have things changed, or have they changed? I mean, are you still fighting for the same things? Because obviously there's a bigger system at play than just one person being in power.
Yes, well, of course, for us it was a big victory to took off Bolsonaro from being president, and of course electing Lula again. It opened a new perspective for the struggles in Brazil, not just for the landless, but in general for the society and especially the left-wing parties and organizations. But yes, we still need to advance much more than we have on this first year. The situation of agrarian reform in terms of numbers, it's almost the same that in the beginning of the Lula's term, this new term of Lula's government. So, of course, there was very structural problems in the way that the public institutions were organized, because Bolsonaro, one of the ways of action was to destroy all these public institutions that were supposed to make the agrarian reform and to solve the land concentration problem in Brazil. So this year, it was a year also to reorganize all the structure of the government related with the land issues. But we know that it's not just that. The thing is that we don't have a very significant budget for solving the question of agrarian reform. We know that agribusiness is like one of the highest powers in Brazilian society. So they have a lot of political powers. They have a lot of ideological power with all the propaganda they made in media. So for us, the land issue is still a very central one for Brazilian society, and we are still hoping that Lula's government could advance much more. We are MST organized around 450,000 families who have already their land and are producing food in their lands. But we still have around 65,000 families who are still waiting for having a piece of land so they can live and produce food and produce their survival. So yes, we are still waiting a more energetic action from part of the government.
You know, Anna, I'm really glad you mentioned the issue of the power of agribusiness, because I know one of the big issues MST has had to face is these big agribusiness companies using, you know, thugs basically to come and to attack the encampments and even sometimes kill people. Is this something that you're still facing as the struggle continues here now, 40 years on?
Yes, of course. And even in this last year, we have seen the violence just growing a lot against landless people, but also against indigenous people and against what we call quilombos, which are black communities in the countryside who have a historical organization of poor people and black people. So in this last year, we have seen a lot of cases of violence, including murdering of indigenous leaderships and quilombolas also. So we are very worried about this, because during Bolsonaro's government, guns were somehow liberated much more, and one of the groups that really took guns to somehow, they say self-defense, but we know it's not just that, it's property defense, were the landowners and were the big companies also of the agribusiness who have private security companies joining them for protect their properties. And so this is something that we are still facing until nowadays. Even this year, we have already very symbolic and some cases of violence and that.
I mean, I'm also curious, when it comes to, obviously you're Brazil based, but we do see, I guess, farmers protests happening in other parts of the world. In France right now, we had the farmers protest in India, which has a lot to do with land. And so I'm just curious, do you see your organization as an internationalist one? I know you do, but can you talk a little about the sort of internationalist take on the world? Because obviously the idea of taking land for the people is something that transcends any one country.
Yes, of course. Land is a big issue all over the world. It's because it's like how can we say, the first source of wealth. It's where now the biggest disputes around the green solutions for the environmental crisis are being mentioned. No, land can provide a lot of assets from nature, minerals and things that are needed for technology. So when MST starts, the biggest question was land in their improductive way, just like a source of power and of money. Now land it's in the center of the one who provides all these assets that the capitalism needs to continue. So we are seeing that now all over the world there are a lot of conflicts, even wars, that are based on the land issue, because it's on places where land has a lot to provide. And the ones who are taking care of those lands, the farmers, the peasants, the traditional communities, need to be moved from there. So they cannot be something who will stop the advance of the capitalist companies in the exploitation of land. So for us, it's not just a problem of Brazil or of Latin America. It's all over the world. In the African continent, we're seeing a lot of conflicts that has on his essential meaning the struggle for this research, this natural research, and of course the domination of territories and land. So that's why for MST, we believe that our struggle cannot be just in Brazil. Our struggle is international. So we receive a lot of support from other parts of the world, from a lot of peasant movements around the world. But for us, it's like essential in our political practice also to express our solidarity, also to support peasant movements and farmers, small farmers movements around the world. So we have a lot of brigades around the world with people of MST who are making exchanges with other comrades, and we are always in supporting of all those who are struggling in other parts of the world, like you mentioned in India. India is very symbolic for us because they really can mobilize millions of peasants, but also in other parts of the world. And of course, also with all the situation in Palestine, we also believe it's in the center of all the genocide. It's this is the question of land. No, so for us, it's very important to have this international perspective of the struggle of the peasants.
Mm-hmm. And one final thing I just wanted to ask that I think is an important part of the discourse that MST is brought to this conversation of agriculture is agroecology. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the MST's approach to that.
Okay, so for us, like I was saying, it's not just a question of democratization of land. That's, of course, it's like the first step for us as a movement who struggles for land and for agrarian reform. But we really believe we need to have a different relation with the nature, with the researches of nature, with the land. So we believe that we need to produce food, but not producing food in a large scale farms, with the use of pesticides, and even with relations of exploitation among human beings. So for us, we need to change the way of producing land, and model of producing land for us, we give it the name of agroecology. It's on this agroecology. It's a scientific proposal, but also a live changing proposal for countryside, and especially for those who have any kind of relation with the production of food and of land. So agroecology, it's, yes, producing food without doing no damage to environmental, but it's also to produce food having good and relations among human beings. It's doing it in a cooperative way. So it's not like individuals who are going to do their own agriculture. We truly believe that we need to do that in a cooperative way. It's also to strengthen the culture, the people's culture, and their ancestrality, their relation with nature, but also with all those who struggled before us. So for us, agroecology, it's somehow a way of living, not just a way of producing land, but a way of living that has all these dimensions of human development.
Ana Cha from the Landless Workers Movement of Brazil. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Wow, what a movement! Could you imagine if we had something like that in the U.S.?
Well, I'd like to imagine. For sure. Well, we're going to keep this on the issue of agriculture. We're now going to move to France, where you may or may not have seen farmers have been really rising up there, blocking highways and the like. Very, very notable struggle there. And we are very, very honored to be joined by Morgan Odi, who's a small-scale farmer in France and also a member of La Via Campesina. Morgan, thank you so much for being with us.
Hello. Thank you. Well, I have some trouble. So, I'm really honored to just speak after someone from MST, because actually we are member of the same movement, La Via Campesina. MST is also a member of La Via Campesina, and we, with Confédération Paysanne on the European coordination Via Campesina, we are also part of the same movement. So it's truly farmers' internationalism.
Right on. Well, that's fantastic. I love that connection, and we really appreciate you being willing to talk to us here. I think maybe some folks have maybe seen some of the videos, seen the headlines. They know farmers have been blocking highways and the like in France, but maybe don't know much more than that. So what's the essence of this struggle? What are the central issues for farmers in France that have caused them to take to the streets?
Well, farmers are struggling for dignity, for a fair income, because over the last year we've seen the cost of production increasing a lot, but the prices to which we sell our products have not increased. So in the end, we have no more income to survive. And so this has created a huge frustration within the farmers, not only in France, but so many European countries, from Romania, Poland, the Netherlands, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and also in France. So people started to block the roads with the tractors. There have been thousands of farmers, mainly small-scale farmers, middle-scale farmers, going outside, blocking the roads, going to Paris. And so today, with the European coordination, we were in Brussels in a very massive movement. There were more than 1,300 tractors in the city of Brussels. Brussels was completely of tractors in front of a meeting of the European Council, because all this, it's about neoliberalism. It's about the fact that these neoliberal policies of free trade agreements, market deregulation, this is killing us. It's not allowing us to make a living out of our work. That's the reason why people are protesting so strongly.
Well, no, I want you to keep talking if there's more you have to say on that. I just wanted to ask if you could not touch the mic, because because it's making a noise on the audio. No, it's okay, because what you're saying is so wonderful. I just want everybody to be able to hear it. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please continue what you were saying.
No, we were just looking at the images of Brussels today, and what is extremely frustrating is that in front of this massive demand for fair income, for fair livelihood for farmers in Europe, the response by political leaders, it's dramatic. They are only proposing to cut on environmental measures. So they say, oh, you can use more pesticides, you can use more chemical products. That's not what we ask. Because we know that we need to do an agroecological transition. We are the first victim of climate change and of the biodiversity crisis. But when we produce in an agricultural way, it costs more than when we produce with pesticides. Pesticides is a way to be competitive. So in order to get rid of the pesticides, we need to be able to get better prices. And for this, we need protection and we need support from public policies. That is what farmers all over Europe have been asking, and we are not being heard. So I am concerned, to be honest, tonight. I'm concerned because I've heard the speeches of Macron, the speeches of von der Leyen at the European level, and they are not responding to our demands at all. So I think that the landless will continue, the frustration will continue. We need to maintain a strong movement so that all our demands are really being heard.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I think is notable about this, and one that seems to be happening now, and I'm glad you made the point about the speeches of the politicians, is we're also seeing sort of contradictory statements about whether or not the farmers' protests are going to stop. And, some individuals from some of the unions saying, oh, we are going to lift the blockades, and then farmers saying, no, we're going to keep protesting. So talk about that a little bit if you could, because it seems like there's a little bit of confusion about whether your demands are being met or not.
Well, in a way, that is a very old bad game. The main farmers' union of the big farmers, their boss in France, this guy, he has 800 hectares. So he's a huge farmer. And he's also the boss of a very big agro-industry called Avril Sofipotel, which is doing trade of commodities, of agricultural commodities. So the interest of this guy is not the interest of most of the farmers in Europe. But he's using the protest of the farmers to make his needs being heard by the politicians. And this is where we are being manipulated. But in Confederação Paysanna, in Via Campesina, we have decided very clearly that we would not let the frustration, the feeling of angerness of the peasants be captured by FNSEA. So we decided to go to the streets as well. And right now the situation is that FNSEA, so the big farmers union, decided to quit the movement. But we are still in it. We are still continuing. We are still blocking. And we will not go away before all demands for fair revenues are being met.
So for some reason, sorry to be the audio person today, but for some reason, there's still a sound in the audio. I think it might actually be your earphones or microphones. I'm wondering if maybe just unplug them and let's see if that sounds better. Can you just unplug and just talk directly? Keep doing. Yeah, just unplug the earphones and let's.
Can you hear me better? I don't hear you anymore.
So much better. Yes. Can you hear me?
Well, she can't hear us.
I can't hear you, so I need to plug it again. Sorry.
Here's what we're gonna. It's always fun when everybody gets to be a part of the fun tech stuff. Okay, yes. How about I'm going to ask you a question, and when you answer it, I want you to just take off the earphones, because I guess there's just something off about the mic, because the audio quality is so much better just directly on the phone. But what I wanted to ask you is, what has so far been the reaction from the media and from the government to these protests?
So, on the media, it's been completely incredible. We are small-scale farmers. Over the last 10 days, me and the comrades of the organization, we've been jumping from one TV show to another radio interview to another. It's been completely crazy. So there is strong media attention over this, which I would say to be honest, it's almost too much, because at the same time we see the genocide in Palestine happening, and this is not getting the media attention that it should get in the Western countries. So well, we are happy that the farmers' protest is getting attention, but at the same time, we are so much Eurocentric. When something is happening in Europe, it's always so much more important than things which are more problematic, which are really terrible going in other countries. And the governments have been taking this very much seriously, because the capacity with tractors, the capacity of farmers in Europe to block the countries is very high. So already for 2 weeks, the governments have been really they are not responding all demands. But my organization, for example, we have met the Prime Minister twice in the 10 days, which normally never happens. And the guy, he has been there for 2 weeks. He has been appointed 2 weeks ago, and my colleagues who went to meet him say he's already completely exhausted because the farmers we are making him with a difficult life. So it's getting attention. The problem is the manipulation. Is that instead of responding all real demands, which are about social justice in the end, which are about the rights of workers, of us in the land, they are manipulating and they are responding completely on other topics, cutting on environmental measures and other things. So yeah, we see that on one side we are able to get media attention, we are able to get the attention of the governments, but on the other side there is a big manipulation. One thing that I think we have been successful in France over the last weeks is that, I don't know if you remember, 1 year ago there was a farmers' protest in the Netherlands, and very much manipulated by the far right, and that led to a far right political party to win the national elections. When the movement started in Germany, we were quite afraid that it would lead to the same. So that's also one of the reasons why in La Via Campesina we decided to react very promptly and to mobilize very strongly to not let the far right capture this movement. And we've been very clear that it's not about migration. Actually, migrant workers are working in the food systems, they are working in the farms, they are working in slaughterhouses, in food factories. They are key workers for the food system. And so we should not put any blame on them. On the contrary, because they are playing a key role to produce the food in our countries. And so this is a success. I think that the attempt, the far right, to capture the movement and to manipulate the movement, at least that has not been successful. Mm-hmm. And I plug again to hear your question.
No. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and it's a crucially important struggle, and I really appreciate you being willing to join us, Morgan, in the midst of everything, in the midst of protesting, to help us sort through it. We'll definitely have to bring you back as it continues to develop, but thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening.
Well, I do want to apologize. I think maybe there was something off about the line, because what she was saying was so fantastic, but we had a few... we had some audio, some technological gremlins in that audio, Eugene.
Wow, I really appreciate that you've stuck with the gremlins thing.
I will never stop saying technological gremlins.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do. Maybe there's a way we can clean it up, but nevertheless, if not, we will just bring Morgan back and we'll figure it out the next time. It's a crucially important struggle and a really important one. And yeah, they're trying to put a lid on it today, but I mean, it's really amazing to see what they're doing. They arrested 79 people yesterday too, by the way, and they're saying, they've mobilized 15,000 cops. So they're saying, what's that?
Did what in China? They arrested how many people in China?
Well, if you watch yesterday's hearing with Tom Cotton, with the guy from TikTok, he asked about the Tiananmen Square issue. It was honestly an amazing. That was Ted Cruz, who did some sort of mathematical calculation about the number of tweets about TikToks about Taylor Swift and the number of TikToks about the Uyghurs. I got to be honest with you. It seems so stupid I couldn't really look into it. But I think the implication he was making was somehow they were suppressing the Uyghur. I don't know. It's like the whole...
Taylor Swift is suppressing the Uyghurs?
I don't even know. Maybe, yes. That's probably what they think. That'll be the next thing because they hate her because she dates Travis Kelce. And they hate Travis Kelce because he's in the Pfizer commercial for the vaccine. But either way, the thing that's ridiculous about the whole thing, the hearing yesterday was ostensibly about keeping kids safe online. And ostensibly, the Senate and the House are working on a bill to keep kids safe online. This is one of the issues they've raised on TikTok. And now, as they often have pointed out, in China, TikTok does not allow all this terrible content that many kids see here to be seen because that's the law. So rather than just change the law so that the things they don't like about TikTok, and I think many of us would like to see change to make sure that kids aren't seeing, negative things on social media and are seeing positive content. Instead of actually just doing it, they instead spend hours grilling these people over basically partisan electoral concerns in order to get little clips that they can put on social media so that they can then raise money. So it was so just, this is an overused phrase, but Kafkaesque. I mean, to watch this, like Tom Cotton, why do you even care what the guy who is the head of TikTok thinks about Tiananmen Square in 1990? 1989, excuse me. Why do you even care? If you don't like what TikTok's doing, just change the law. You have all the opportunity in the world. But you'd rather get these little clicks by essentially abusing this guy in a racist way. I don't really know what else to call it.
Do you think Tom Cotton was sent here on Earth to replace Lindsey Graham?
No, because Lindsey Graham is, I think, actually a better, more winning personality than Tom Cotton. Like Lindsey Graham is a terrible person, but he's actually good at pretending to be like a nice, good guy. Loves golf. Feel like you like to play 9 holes with him. I feel like Tom Cotton, he just doesn't seem like someone you want to spend time with. So he was certainly sent here by a lot of really rich people. That's for sure.
Yeah, he was made in a little laboratory, but they messed up a little bit because he legitimately comes off as a psychopath, whereas Lindsey Graham will give you a smile and a cute South Carolina accent that sort of makes him seem like he has manners while he calls for nuking the world. Yeah. Tom Cotton is just we must nuke the world immediately because I hate everything and everyone and I'm crazy. Tom Cotton also wants us to bomb Iran. In response, he's please, Joe Biden, anything less than bombing Iran is basically treachery.
Yeah, it was kind of his biggest issue. I mean, that was one of the things he kind of rode to Congress on, at the tail end of the Obama administration there. But anyway, let's not spend any more time on Tom Cotton.
No, he doesn't
although
deserve
shout
it.
out to the great state of Arkansas, great state, the natural resources state. I
have a question for you, Eugene.
Yes.
I have a question for you. I think there's something very interesting that I know you're going to talk about, so I'm going to prompt you on it, but let's make it look really natural. There's something really interesting happening in the world, Eugene. No, but it is very interesting. You have this Africa-Italy summit coming up. And what's interesting about this, I'm sorry, my apologies. This is why I have to ask you about it because I thought it was about to happen. But it's interesting because obviously Italy right now is under the rule of Giorgia Meloni, which is this, far-right character that got quite a bit of attention for breaking that glass ceiling when she came to power in Italy back in 2022, I believe it was. But of course, has very far-right politics, which you would think would be kind of antithetical to having an Africa summit. So tell me what's going on there. Why did Giorgia Meloni of Italy want to do this Africa summit? What happened there? And what does it mean? Because I did see some criticism from the CNN. I wasn't really sure how to interpret it. Their criticism was that she did an Africa summit without engaging with African leaders. So I'm not sure what that was about. But yeah, explain to us what the summit was. Why is it significant? And what is far-right politician Giorgia Meloni doing trying to be friends with Africa?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really important question, right? Because, ostensibly what she is doing is she's saying, I'm pursuing a new paradigm for Africa. We can't just be upset at the people who are coming to Europe in terms of migration. We can't keep them out through military means alone. We have to promote development in Africa, which, on its face sounds great, right? It's, when you hear Kamala Harris say we have to deal with root cause issues. Yes, we have to deal with root cause issues. And, Giorgia Meloni in many ways became kind of popular in Africa because prior to of being the prime minister, she was in a TV conversation, in a debate over immigration, and she was really laying into France and talking about how the CFA franc and all these other policies are impoverishing Africa. So, from sort of then to now, she has tried to frame her politics, which are extremely racist, under the guise of, like, I actually really care about these Africans. And these liberals who are upset at us because of migration, they don't really care. They just want to do brain drain. They don't want to do this. They don't want to do that. So having the summit was a way of her trying to lay down a marker. They're also Italy's the G7 presidency this year. So to lay down a marker that for Italy in general under her rule, and for the sort of global north under the G7 presidency of Italy, that they're going to be turning the page and, doing good things for Africa. And this was the same thing with the EU Africa Summit that happened last year. It's the same thing with the U.S. Africa Summit that happened last year. So I think it's all a piece of these attempts by the countries that are exploiting Africa the most to, in a time where Africans themselves are demanding a change in the paradigm, to appear to change in the paradigm. And I think that's what's important about the summit, and why I wanted to talk about it in a way, because I really feel people have to be very careful with how these things are playing out, because the conversation around root cause issues, quote unquote, and development in Africa is not actually matched by the realities of what is taking place there. And thus, I think, it's in the same way, sort of, the critics of the Malonis of the world who are criticizing immigration controls, and rightfully, quite frankly, because they're just turning the Mediterranean Sea into a graveyard, but are, really in a way using those beliefs to kind of mask a policy that's designed to keep those countries poor and to try to, pull the most talented people out of those countries and, then employ them for a lot less money in these European countries. I think a lot of these right-wing people, what they really want to do is put in these much more aggressive militarized policies, but they know that it looks so bad and so racist. They're looking for a discourse to cover their changes. And by the way, one of the elements of this so-called partnership is that African countries, in order to get the money, the $6 billion, and we'll get to that being offered by Italy, have to do more to stop quote unquote small boats. And if you live in any European country, this is like the big thing now, stopping small boats, especially in the UK. And so ultimately you have an attempt to try to double and triple down on turning the Mediterranean into a graveyard for African people, but doing it in a way that makes it look good. But that being said, the mask was ripped off partially, and this is the point you made about CNN, because so they unveiled this $6 billion. And the $6 billion over an unknown number of years is meaningless. It has been well documented that Africa needs maybe $68 to $100 billion every single year to close the development gap. And even when you hear the numbers like the EU pledging $32 billion, it's over a long amount of years. Some of the money is loans, and a lot of it never actually appears, because it's not like just money in the bank. It's things they say they're going to do that they never do. So anyway, Italy comes out with their own fake version of this, just like the EU as a whole, just like the U.S. last year. This is why countries like to work with China, because China tends to deliver their projects while the West tends to just talk about them. But that being said, she rolls out the $6 billion as this huge thing. But apparently she had not actually spoken with any of the African leaders as to this plan. So that was the first time they heard it. So the head of the AU then stands up and says in his speech, he was surprised to hear that, and that it would have been nice if if they had been given a heads up ahead of time, but that ultimately it misunderstood the whole purpose of Africa and the African leaders even coming to the conference. He said, we're not looking for handouts, and then went on to make the general point that what they're looking for are real, the end of neo-colonialism, essentially, in order for Africa to really develop. So it ended up being a pretty embarrassing moment for Giorgia Meloni, because not only was the sum of money so paltry that is basically meaningless in terms of what Africa really needs, but it turns out that it was, basically totally cosmetic. And I just say two final things on this. I don't think we need to talk about it forever, but I did just want to mention it because in Africa, it's certainly a big story. On the one hand, it is interesting that he critiqued her for that, and it's interesting to hear those things happening more and more. But on the other hand, they didn't also have to show up. And I think this is the critique of so many African people, just rank and file people of these summits, wherever they may be, including I think a lot of people feel this about the summits in Russia and China, is it's always all these African leaders going to some other country to say what is Africa's part in their agenda or view. These African countries never go and say, here is our agenda, how can you fit in that role? And I think this is partially why you see things like what's happening in the Sahel, because people are tired of these neo-colonial leaders that really don't care about establishing a real agenda to end poverty and to lift people up out of Africa. So as much as he's blaming Giorgia Meloni, I think, African leaders can blame themselves, including, by the way, Kenyan President William Ruto, who said, I'll never go to another one of these summits because of what I just said. And he not only was there, but then praised Giorgia Meloni for being such a great host and giving money to Africa. So pretty embarrassing. I would say the only thing I might describe as a bright spot is the president of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki, was not only there, but in the sort of family photo that those end photos they call was in a pretty prominent position, met directly with the prime minister. And I think that's relevant because obviously Western countries have, tried to pursue a policy of demonization of isolation of Eritrea. That's broken down over the past year as Kenya, Russia, China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, many other countries have been trying to get closer to Eritrea. They've been having good relations. They're doing deals with one another and so on and so forth. And now all of a sudden, you see the Western countries say, oh, hey, wait a second. Now, will anything come of this? It's tough to say because I think ultimately the biggest challenge and what has always happened when there's slightly better relations between the West and Eritrea is Eritrea, says the same thing they say to every country. Here are our terms if you want to work with us. And these countries in the global north oftentimes say, well, no, we want to exploit you really much worse than that. So we're just not going to do a deal with you. So we'll see what happens. But I think from a propaganda perspective, it's an important issue. It's like, any of these countries that are heavily demonized, heavily isolated, heavily sanctioned, when they're able to sort of defeat that diplomatic pressure and appear in different fora, I think it plays an important role into starting to break down the general logic of these types of sanctions. And I hope that the EU and the U.S. Will continue to do that. I think it's a good thing, not a bad thing, even though I don't think they have good motives. I don't think there needs to be sanctions and isolation on these countries. So you might say that's a bright spot, is that it didn't seem like they were excluding people on the basis of these totally bogus sanctions and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I expect very little for any African country except for Algeria, most likely, maybe a little bit Egypt and others, because since Italy, under Giorgia Meloni, for her to become the prime minister, signed up to the war in Ukraine hysteria, Italy has lost all the cheap gas from Russia. So they're trying to get more gas from Africa. This has been a big theme in Italy over the past year, from the big companies like Eni to the prime minister herself. There's a lot of deals happening and already in the works. They want to make Italy the southern gas hub for Europe. So especially for Algeria, but also to some degree for Libya, to some degree for Egypt and others, they may see some benefits because they're in a position where they can kind of hold Europe over a barrel. But I think by and large, we're seeing yet again on both sides big challenges. You see the global north with these fake BS summits where they're not doing anything for Africa in a real way, but claiming that they are. And then on the other hand, so many of these African neo-colonial leaders that just love to be in the photos and are really doing nothing to contribute to developing a common African agenda by which you can significantly pressure places like the European Union, like the United States, or quite frankly, anyone who wants to be an interlocutor with Africa to only be able to engage on terms that are favorable to Africans. So a lot to happen there. But at the end of the day, the entire movement behind Giorgia Meloni is a bunch of racist. And people should really not be confused about that. If anyone thinks she wants to develop Africa, then believe Mussolini wanted to develop Africa, because her political party has direct roots to Mussolini. It's all just a cover. It's all just a cover to have even worse policies, but it's a nice discourse, so it's designed to calm people down and make them think somehow this could be good for them while continuing to pursue policies that won't help the continent at all. So I did just want to mention that since it's been a relatively big story. So a few bright spots here and there, like I said, but nonetheless, I think a continued negativity around this summit diplomacy in Africa.
It really is. I appreciate your breakdown and analysis of all that. It's so important. And I want to remind everybody who's watching that Eugene does do a monthly seminar in Africa. That's so important. And you can access it by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a member. super important stuff. It's such an important continent. I mean, Africa's over 1 billion people, and it's the really resource hub of the world. It's the richest part of the world, and for that reason, everything is under, or imperialist countries try to control and extract as much as possible, and it leads to all kinds of bad politics and bad leadership, and also lots of movements of resistance. And I think we're seeing so much play out right now. So that goes beyond Italy Africa Summit. But I do think it's an interesting dynamic, especially just Italy doing it. It does speak to, it speaks to the fact that when it comes to Europe, it's not a united place. Like, I think oftentimes when we talk about Europe, we think it's this place where it's like the US or something. It's just a bunch of states that are a part of one country, but it's not. Each of these are countries with different politics and different leaders and different policies. And so it is interesting that Italy would go this alone. But I also want to use that as a sort of a segue just to say, I did just do an interview with 2 European members of parliament who made that point to me, not about Italy, but about the fact that Europe is not united. And that's Claire Daly and Mick Wallace. I encourage people to go check this out after this live stream. It was a really cool interview. And they were speaking out, not just about Gaza, actually. They spoke up about colonialism in Africa, too. And it kind of struck me as interesting because we don't have anyone who speaks like that in the U.S. in Congress. So I wish we did. Like, they're speaking openly about genocide, Palestinian right to return, and just about how horrific and racist and disgusting the imperialist global north is when it comes to the way they treat the rest of the world. So that's all to say. Thank you, Eugene. And yeah, you do the usual closing. Wait, I have one more thing to say.
Yes.
For those who are watching, make sure that you like button. That's it. Thank you. I don't need to say it anymore. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you. I don't have to say it. I love it. I want that to be my new ringtone, by the way.
Oh my God. On that note, don't forget you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a recurring donor. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we have nearly 600,000 followers on YouTube. Maybe we're over at this point, but we'll be there soon. If all of our YouTube followers gave $5 a month, it would be $30-some million. I mean, you could just see how a relatively small sacrifice, basically the cost of a cup of coffee, could, in fact, make a huge, huge difference in what we're able to do and what we're able to bring you on all these topics and many more. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can get cool things like these mugs. You get access to exclusive content. And there's only more coming and more happening. So on behalf of myself, Rania, whole Breakthrough News team, as always, we will see you next time.